So what I want to do with this time is share with you some insights we have around the state of the app market, and more specifically, also share with you some recent analysis we've been doing around the games market. And in some cases, challenge some perceptions or misperceptions, I'd even say, about what's happening from a competitive standpoint. And I'm assuming most of you are well aware of who App Annie is. App Annie's been covering the app market in terms of providing the data insights publishers need to succeed for the better part of 7.5 years. But for those of you that may be a bit less familiar with who we are, just briefly, what we do is to ultimately provide the data, the services, and insights to support a range of different companies throughout the app lifecycle. And when you think about this app lifecycle, we sort of think of it initially as there's this strategy phase, right? And you think about what are the markets you're looking to go into, geographically speaking, demographically speaking, maybe subcategories and so forth, right? And you're building out your app, and what are the features, functions, et cetera. And so you have to strategize who's winning, what do those KPIs look like for success in a given market or for a given category or subcategory, right? And then from there, you have to drive acquisition. And so we have a number of tools and data sets that help you with App Store optimization, that help you in terms of driving that overall UA, and then to measure that, obviously, from an install or download perspective. But once you get those customers, right, you have to keep them engaged. So whether it's a function of sessions or time spent, or you think about active users, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, right? What does your attention look like relative to your peers and so forth? It's that kind of data that can really help. And then, of course, it comes back to monetization and ROI. And so when we think about why we do this and how we do this, game publishers are where this all started, right? You go back to the beginning of the App Store, and I'll sort of do a brief trip down memory lane in this talk. And what you see is that the game publishers were there first, especially those that came from the online PC space, right? And then you had the Supercells of the world, these companies that came out of nowhere, essentially, and really embraced mobile. And then you had social and comms companies, then media and entertainment. And in the last 2 years, we've seen our customers dramatically expand as they embrace mobile as a primary platform. Increasingly, it's not a need to have, a nice to have, right? It's a need to have. And so whether it's retailers, or you think about banks, or you think about the role of, QSRs and CPG really starting to transform their business through mobile. And we have now essentially 500 employees across 15 locations. The app market is global. We're global because we meet our customers where they are. And when you're talking about over 3 billion users, it's an incredibly global opportunity that's continuing to expand. So let's jump into the content and the data and talk a little bit briefly about the birth of the app market. So it's 2017. We all know what our behavior is like today, but it was just 10 years ago that we had the launch of the iPhone. And essentially 13 months later, we had the launch of the App Store. At the beginning of the launch of the App Store, it was 500 apps. It's kind of a cute, quaint number when you think about it, especially with the challenge of discovery today, right? And then, of course, when you look at what happened on the Android side and the Open Handset Alliance, and that coming together and sort of the first devices coming out in the November 2007 timeframe, and then the store essentially launching around the Android space essentially a year later. And it really, Google Play was something that came to be essentially 4 years after that. But at the time of this initial store launch, right, you're talking about 50 apps available. So this is sort of where we were just, essentially 9 years ago with the launch of the App Store. And when you take it a step further and you think about where we are today, and all these apps that have been published across the 2 major app stores, you're talking about 5.5 million apps. Dramatically different place where we are today. And so let's talk a little bit about the state of the market today. And what I want to share with you over the course of this section of the presentation are some key statistics that we're seeing in our data. We see it through our users. We see it in terms of their level of engagement across different types of apps, across different geographies. And what we see today when we look at this is that the time spent in apps has grown by more than 50% in the last year. And that's growing both because existing users are spending more time because apps are fulfilling a wider and wider range of activities and delivering value across them. But we also see it growing, obviously, because new users continue to come on board. When you talk about essentially 3.4 billion devices, active install base by the end of last year, you're talking about we're approaching that 3 billion users in that time frame, right? And this is what is really helping to continue to drive the innovation and the centrality of mobile to any company's strategy. And when you break it down, it means in mature markets, we're talking about 2 hours per day spent in apps. 2 hours per day. That is equivalent to essentially a month out of your life each year. And in the US, it's a little higher. It's about 2 hours and 15 minutes. And depending on which country you're in, you see a bit higher, a bit lower, but in general, it's about that 2 hours a day in the mature markets. And you take that a step further, and you start to think about, okay, so we're spending all this time, and the assumption, I think, for a lot of people is just like, okay, it's all spent in Facebook. And the reality is, when you look at it, we are using a range of different apps. So I'm going to ask it as a quiz, and I'll make it as accessible and sort of pointed as possible, and narrow it down to the US, and ask you, how many apps on average do we use in a month? So we've got a little quiz here, and we've got a few ranges, so we'll do it by a show of hands. So how many of you think that on average Americans use less than 10 apps per month? How many of you think it's 10 to 19? How many of you think it's 20 to 29? How many think it's 30 to 39? And how many of you think it's 40 plus? Okay. So the most popular answer was the 10 to 19. And I've done this quiz across multiple countries over the last few months, and that is continuously the most common answer. In the case for the US, ding, 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 for those of you that guessed the 30 to 39, you are correct. Most of you guessed in that range that I think most people that aren't maybe sort of living in this and looking at this data all the time would have guessed in that, sub 20 range. In the case of the US, it's 35 apps per month on average. Or think of it this way, on a daily basis, 10 or 11 apps per day. From the moment we wake up, right, your alarm was your phone. Maybe you ordered a Lyft or an Uber to get here. Or potentially you're going to order dinner on the way home. Obviously, there's things like mail. There's obviously games, which we'll talk a bit about, right? There is social and comms. And the reality is social and comms are critical to that time spent. But to be clear, when you even take a look at that, more than 80% of our time is spent outside of that top app. On average, an app like Facebook is getting less than 20%. Now, out of 2 hours and 15 minutes a day for Americans, you're still talking about more than 90 minutes that are spent across a whole range of different apps. So keep that in mind as we think about this growth in time spent, more than 50% per year. 3 billion users, right? And you think about this in context and you see the kind of opportunity that exists today and that we expect to continue to expand in the near term. So to put this in context for where we are today, what I want to share is our maturity model. So as somebody who's been an analyst and has looked at industries specifically around mobile, consumer, and digital media for most of my professional life, I'm big on putting some construct around this when you want to understand where is it not only today, but where do we expect it to go over the next few years, right? And so when we look at this, and we looked at our data and the general adoption, obviously it starts with the initial adoption of devices. So in a market like the US, right, it was basically from that 2007 timeframe to about 2011 is when we saw that initial boom, right? Device sales go through the roof and downloads take off with it. There's only 500 apps in one app store and 50 in the other on day one, right? Out of curiosity, how many of you had a Gen 1 iPhone? Man, weren't sure you wanted to buy into that just yet. It didn't have a keyboard, right? But these downloads start to happen early on, right? As you're testing and looking for which apps deliver value for you, which are either entertaining for you, which are delivering some sort of feature function that makes sense for you. And that drives up our usage, right? And the time spent starts to grow. And because of that value that's getting delivered and realized, it then starts to pull through revenue. And revenue takes the form in 3 ways, right? There's App Store revenue, which we'll spend a bit more time talking about because it's near and dear, especially for game publishers. There's in-app advertising, which is increasingly important, it's obviously even bigger in terms of monetization for apps outside of games, but in games, right, it's becoming more and more important as you're looking for ways to monetize, frankly, your non-paying customers, which in many cases could be the majority, especially for so many apps that don't, sort of have a really strong sort of microtransaction model beyond their whales. And so that's been sort of a critical element that's growing. And then, of course, there's commerce, which is really applicable for goods and services that are sold in other verticals. And so when we think about this from a geographical standpoint, to give you some context, I'd argue today the most mature market is Japan. When you look at where it is in terms of downloads, revenue, and usage, it is at this stage where downloads are still in the billions, right? But they're either flat or slightly down in the low single digits year on year. And then you have a market like US growing in low single digits from the downloads, right? But revenue and usage continues to grow, especially on the revenue front as more and more goods and services are ultimately delivered, as advertising increasingly gets focused on mobile, right? All these different monetization streams coming through. On the emerging side, there's a market like Brazil, which for the last 2 to 3 years has been a key growth segment for the overall mobile space and specifically around apps. India has been the shining star of the last 18 months or so, right? Device sales have been just growing phenomenally. In the case of the App Store, and specifically for Google Play, it's the largest market in terms of downloads over the last 2 quarters. So it's in that really early stage of just phenomenal growth. China's a really interesting one because China's really a tale of 2 markets, right? You look at tier 1 cities and they look and behave just like a Tokyo or a San Francisco or Seattle or a Seoul. They behave like that in terms of just the overall penetration in those tier 1 cities, the usage, and the monetization. But as you look to lower tier cities, which are much larger than most of our largest cities in this country, right, there is still a large portion of the market that is yet to really adopt these devices in a meaningful way, let alone spend and monetize in a meaningful way. And that's where so much of the growth is going to come from emerging markets, from lower tier cities in China and so forth. So let's switch gears a bit and talk a bit about gaming specifically, because that's why I think we're all here at Casual Connect. So to give you some context around the number of games we play per month, I probably should have done this one as a quiz. So on average, gamers are playing about 4 games per month. On a daily basis, they're in a game, essentially once a day in a game. I shouldn't say that. They're in at least 1 game per day on average. So this gives you some overall context in terms of the overall level of engagement and diversity, if you will. And this is across, obviously, 9 different countries here to give you a different sense of what this picture looks like. And then I'm going to share with you some time on the next slide, but as we go through this section of the presentation, and as I take you through this, we're going to talk about some of these geographical differences because there are significant differences. And I think for those of you that are looking at expanding into new geographies or trying to understand what are some of these fundamental differences, this is really, I think, something that we wanted to bring to light. So let's talk about whales, essentially, right? Those that are spending the most time in games. So the top 10% in terms of time spent are spending over an hour per day in games globally. So to give you that average across the board, right? Not surprisingly, for those of you that already know the Asian markets really well, and you look at some of those North Asian countries, right? You look at a market like Japan, you look at a market like Korea, you're talking about the top 10% spending 3 hours a day in mobile games. And this obviously is sort of this critical element, but what's really important to point out is that essentially every country except for France has seen a continued growth year on year. So it's not just about getting new users in, right? It's the fact that we're actually expanding the time spent by our existing gamers. And this is also critical at fueling it, as well as obviously adopting, new monetization strategies, which I know has been a critical topic in a lot of these sessions. If we take a look at some of the historical data over the last several years, what I really want to point out in this slide is that this notion that there's sort of this topping out, and this is just App Store revenue, is false. We continue to see incredibly strong growth in terms of App Store monetization of games on a global basis. And this is ranked by the top markets, not surprisingly. I'll also call out this China data is iOS only. When you factor in third-party Android, we estimate that, it surpassed essentially every other market 2 years ago. And so when you think about this in context and you see this growth, this becomes a really critical element when you think about what does this mean for game development and genre? What does this mean for partnering or M&A? And so let's sort of take this a step further and talk about local preferences. So this slide is showing you for the top categories the revenue spent. And I'm going to share it across a few different countries, but at a global basis, just to sort of set the stage, what you see here is a general breakdown. And hopefully you guys, I think, should be able to see it from the back, but it's role-playing, strategy, then action, puzzle, casual, casino, and other. What's really interesting is when you layer on the dramatic differences of, say, the couple of the largest Western markets and a couple of the largest Asian markets. And you see that RPG and strategy, right? Look at that RPG number when you look to a market like Korea or Japan, right? In the case of South Korea, it grew from about 40% of the dollars to 60% of the dollars over the last 2 years. In the case of Japan, it grew about 15 points over the last 2 years, so not quite double. If you look to the UK and specifically at the strategy segment, that's grown about 2.5 times as its share. And so understanding where people are not just spending their time, but where they're obviously spending on dollars is obviously critical. And I think the other thing that's really interesting to point out, which is obviously some big bucket here of other. Other essentially was single digits when you go back 2 years ago. And to me, when you look at the fact that other is now essentially 20% of the global market in terms of spend, it's a clear indication that now as we have an additional billion plus users over the last couple of years, more than that really, we're able to expand the gamer population. And that really allows for competition, innovation, and expanding the overall spend on games. If you take a look at China and sort of we'll dive in a step further, I want to sort of explain what you're looking at on this slide. So you can see it says average monthly ARPU. So for this case, we're looking at 1 quarter of data, and it's the second quarter of this year. So it's those 3 months averaged together. So that's why it's monthly average of ARPU, okay? And what we did is we looked at the top 30 games in those markets. Couple things I want to call out when you're looking at sort of what does this mean and the dots versus the bars, right? The bars are the average. They're telling you the average spend of these top 30 games. And you can see China approaching that $25 a month mark, Japan a bit lower. And if you compare this year on year, what's fascinating is China has dramatically increased. And yet the games for China, for South Korea, and for Japan are actually the same top games as they were a year ago, and yet we've seen this mix dramatically change. And the point to take away here is Chinese gamers are spending at an incredible rate relative to their peers. And there is this continued expansion of share of wallet from those consumers as mobile starts to consume more and more time. And it's not just happening in games. We see it when you look at commerce. We see it when you look at other categories, in food ordering and so forth. China's been this incredible market to fuel the overall app economy. The other thing I want to point out when you look at this is sort of the spread, right? Those dots represent those 30 games for each of those markets. And you can see a fairly, the size of those, what we call violins within those averages, right, are either wider in some of those Western markets in particular and quite a bit narrower in the case of those Asian markets. And again, an indication of the level of concentration and competition as you can see that overall spend and sort of how many companies are sort of really unique at getting that ARPU versus, a cohort that is, a number of apps that are able to monetize at a high level. So what I want to talk about here also is, we talk a little bit about not just this expansion and international and what China is doing in terms of growth and Chinese consumer spend on games, but if you look at Chinese companies and what they've done to expand outside of China. So what you're looking at here is of the Chinese companies' revenue, if you take that total revenue, of that is actually earned from outside of China, where is it earned? And so you see, not surprisingly, the US market, as big as it is its top sort of export market, for lack of a better way to put it, at about 35%. And then you have markets like the UK, Germany, Japan that are also very large. Taiwan is a top 5 market in terms of export as well. Now, to be clear, if you were to sort of for some benchmark and comparisons, right? If you look at the Chinese spend on games, year on year, it was about a 90% increase in China. If you then look at it in terms of that export, it was over 100%, but to be fair, some of this is based on market consolidation. You take out Supercell from Tencent, it was about 54% growth as opposed to that doubling. And so that is the news of the day, right? Consolidation, when you look at your NetEase and your Tencents of the world, right? It's really hard for companies to export titles as is internationally outside of like a similar demographic, to be candid. You see that time and time again in most instances. And so it's through M&A oftentimes and buying these studios, buying these publishers, that's allowing these companies to get bigger and diversify their overall revenue base. And of course, the writing's on the wall in terms of a lot of expectation around continued consolidation in this market as companies are looking for that extra edge and looking for differentiation. So one of the last things I'll leave you with is to challenge a bit of a myth. So despite this consolidation, what you're looking at on this slide, and I'll explain this in a second, but the main takeaway here is that the market is, and specifically in Western countries, and what you're looking at here in the US, is actually less concentrated in terms of which companies have that revenue than it was 3 years ago. Less concentrated. So despite some of this consolidation or acquisition, whatever you want to call it, and despite, I think, what's sort of assumed to be just it's market consolidation, it's the same top, 20 or so games, the fact of the matter is we actually see the market as being more competitive today than 3 years ago. And it shows up when you look at this in particular, to give you some context on the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So when you think about what those numbers mean, right, 100% means monopoly. And then when you get to about 25% and above, it's considered highly concentrated. And that 15 to 25 is moderately concentrated. And what stands out in particular with the casual segment, that has a lot to do with Candy Crush, right, and its various iterations. And it's just been so dominant in the casual space. And so that's really driving sort of that higher level of concentration there. But I think the point here is we continue to see innovation. And so whether it was the slide a couple slides ago where other is now 20% of dollars spent globally in games, where it was next to nothing 2 years ago, and you look at a market like the US and other Western markets where there's actually less concentration of revenue than there was 3 years ago, it's an indication to me that there's an appetite to ultimately play and spend on games that are outside of the dominant ones. And that's goodness for innovation. That's goodness for newer publishers or for new titles from publishers. And really starting to look at other ways to capture share of time and share of wallet by not just getting more time from your existing gamers, but by converting people who don't self-identify as gamers. And so the last thing I'll leave you with before I wrap is where do we go from here? And so just sharing in terms of our outlook around consumer spend on games globally, and this is across the Apple App Store, Google Play, and third-party Android, we're forecasting that it'll essentially grow from just over $50 billion in consumer spend to more than about $105 billion by 2021. And this is all App Store revenue. When you factor in advertising, you're talking about adding, another at least 20 and potentially closer to 30 billion in that time frame. Because we do see advertising, whether you hear about whether it's rewarded video and native and so forth, as a way to monetize those gamers that aren't spending meaningfully in those games. And so there's real opportunity here for continued growth through multiple avenues. And that, I think, is one of the really exciting things that we continue to see today, and that we expect to fuel these companies and the innovation that you all bring to the table tomorrow. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and I think I can take a couple questions.
While he's waiting down, I'm going to ask a question. You published some statistic a couple of years ago, which was giving you the percentage breakdown between paid downloads and microtransactions. I think it was only 94, 95%. Is that pretty much the same now, or has it got even more?
In the case of games, it's even more concentrated in terms of microtransactions. If you look at non-games, what gets interesting is subscription has dramatically expanded, but it's considered a form of IAP. But in the case of games, paid continues to be.
You showed figures for China and China exporting to the rest of the world. My perception is that Western companies are finding the Chinese market, for a variety of practical and non-tariff trade barrier reasons, not really able to do business effectively within China. Of that very large market in China, how much of that is effectively closed to the West?
I don't remember the percentage off the top of my head, but in essence, I mean, the local publishers, have a huge dominant position. And I think the reality is for those that do a better job of capturing share of time and share of wallet in China that are foreign publishers, they're obviously in many cases doing it through partnership, right? So if you look at the Android app stores there, right, then you're going into a partnership with someone like a Tencent for distribution, which means you're reducing the percentage that you're netting out in the end. It's not just that 30%. So, but I think the reality is, are you willing to take, let's say, 50% of every dollar or yuan versus nothing when you're talking about now the single largest mobile games market?
On one of your slides earlier, you talked about the number of games that people play a month. Are people serially monogamous about the games that they play, or do they have a portfolio of games and they gradually rotate around and one falls out and another one adds and comes back into the mix?
So I think when you look at sort of broadly in terms of the sheer number of games, there is a fair amount of sort of discovery and sort of downloads on a regular basis to play new games. I think it ultimately comes back to those that are probably the best monetizing consumers do tend to stick with games much longer period of time. And you see this in particular, and obviously with strategy RPG in particular, but even casino games where it's like there'll be a certain set of casino games that a consumer uses and they might go between them, but they're not necessarily experimenting with a ton more. So I think it's sort of those that are monetizing the most are probably the stickiest, right? It sort of makes a lot of logical sense versus like these more casual gamers that I think are more exploratory, if you will, in terms of experimenting with more and more games over time.
The revenue that you are showing, I know it is combined from a new and old apps. So if you can divide this revenue that any games older than 1 year, what will be the percentage of the revenue?
I don't know. That's actually an interesting question. I don't know the number in terms of like how cohorts evolve over time for games that have been around X period of time versus Y, and how would you potentially want to treat? I would think you'd want to treat them separately, but kind of discount them like the Candy Crush series, right? There's different iterations of them. So do you view them as a continuum versus a separate? But I think a new Candy Crush app is not the same thing as Pokemon Go launching last year, right? So I don't know that number off the top of my head, but I'd be curious to follow up and have some discussion there because I think it'd be an interesting one to take a closer look at.
Sure. Okay, we've reached the time. If people want to find out more information about this data or other services you provide, how can they get hold of you?
So at Annie, you can get a hold of us, multiple ways. So first of all, we have a booth right outside and we will be here. So please come track us down. Obviously, you can find us through our site. My contact information was at the beginning. So I'd sort of welcome the engagement. You can tweet us. You can email us. You can talk to us in person. Imagine that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Danielle, and also thank you everyone here for staying around to the end. So give yourselves a round of applause and Danielle a round of applause.